Critical pedagogy. I would like also to introduce to you Henry, our panel, which launches your book in Greek, who are Periklis Pavlidis, the president of our department, George Rolios, emeritus teacher of our department, and the leader of critical pedagogy in Greece, and me, the editor of your book in Greek language, as well as Ioannis Kaskaris, our home grade and colleague teacher in primary education, as well as our vibrant audience. Henry, we are ready to hear your thoughts about the theory and political practice of critical pedagogy. Your thought. Henry, take the floor. Okay.
Are we ready? Are we ready to begin?
Thank you.
Okay, let me, I'll begin. I'm having a little trouble with the sound, so let me begin, and if there's any problems, just let me know. First of all, I want to thank all of you for inviting me here today. I'm certainly honored to have my book translated into Greek, and so is my wife, who happens to be Greek. But I'm delighted to, again, be able to address the audience. What I will do is I'm going to provide, I've written a small text that I want to work from in order to sort of give you some sort of framework for what this book basically is about in terms of what it's arguing. And I think from there, if we have questions, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to begin. The title of this talk, and you may have a handout, is called Education in Dark Times, Fascism, Democracy, and the Power of Critical Pedagogy. So let me begin. You know, we're living in perilous times marked by the collapse of democratic institutions, the rise of neoliberal fascism, the poison of racial cleansing, and the transformation in some ways of education into white nationalist indoctrination factories. That is particularly true for the United States. In the United States and increasingly around the world, we're witnessing a deeply authoritarian project that is as cultural and educational as it is political and economic, a point that's often missed, it seems to me, by many critical theorists and commentators. At the heart of this crisis is a new form of fascism. It's one that doesn't wear a uniform, but cloaks itself in the language of freedom, markets, and religion, what I have called neoliberal fascism, which operates through economic violence, cultural repression, and the strategic erasure of memory, history, and civic literacy. This is not a revival of yesterday's authoritarianism. It's a monstrous evolution of capitalism, turbocharged by predatory finance and weaponized through the all-seeing eye of digital surveillance and what we would call, or should call, the acceleration of state terrorism. Neoliberalism has hollowed out the civic fabric of our societies. It celebrates unrestrained self-interest, privatization, deregulation, extreme individualism, and it decries anything that gets in the way of markets, free trade, and the commodification of all social relations. It reduces citizenship to consumerism and public life to market transactions, and in doing so, it erases the idea of the common good and normalizes staggering levels of inequality, systemic racism, accelerating militarism, and ecological collapse. And it does this while offering the seductive myth that there is no alternative, that capitalism and democracy, in this case, it's argued, are basically the same, which is basically a lie. We now live in an era of gangster capitalism, no longer able to legitimate itself through the promises of upward mobility or social progress. Capitalism has reached a tipping point, one that converges with ultranationalism, racism, and state violence. And the result is a fast-paced descent into 21st century fascism. This is evident not only in Hungary, in India, Argentina, and Italy, but most alarmingly now in the United States, where Donald Trump has returned to power on a platform of open cruelty, authoritarianism, and racial terror. Trumpism is not merely a political movement. It's an authoritarian project aimed at dismantling public education, higher education, and all cultural apparatuses that serve as protective spaces for critical thought. Across the United States, we are witnessing an aggressive campaign to reshape schools and universities into instruments of unadulterated ideological control. Books are banned, professors are attacked, gender and ethnic studies eliminated, trans identities are attacked, student protests criminalized, and honest historical narratives are repressed. This is not merely symbolic, it is state-sanctioned policy. From Florida to Texas in the United States, far-right governors are transforming education into a vehicle of repression. Teachers are threatened with criminal charges for acknowledging gender diversity or reproductive rights in their classrooms. Can you imagine? In Idaho, if a teacher mentions anything that has to do with an anti-abortion stance, they can literally be that act can be criminalized and they can be put in jail. At the national level, as some of you know, I'm sure, student activists, particularly those protesting in the United States against support for the U.S.'s against the U.S. support for the genocidal war in Gaza, they're being surveilled, they're being detained, and in some cases, if they're foreign international students, they're being forcibly abducted and held in detention centers, not only in the United States, but also in places like Venezuela, South Salvador, sorry. These actions mark a dangerous escalation in the use of state power to crush dissent and to stifle democratic expression. This is fascism on steroids. It silences dissent, it erases the past, and extinguishes the future. It aims not only to control education, but to destroy its emancipatory potential, to eliminate the very idea that education might serve as a public good, as a democratic public sphere, create an informed public, and imagine a radical democratic future. Why this obsession with education? Because the far right understands something many liberals forget, that education is dangerous when it teaches people to think, to question, to remember, and to dream. These attacks are not simply about controlling education, they're about eliminating the possibility that education could serve as a democratic public good, one that both defends and enables democracy. The far right understands what many liberals and others forget. Critical education is dangerous when it encourages people to think, to question, to remember, and to act. Educators need a new political and pedagogical language. It's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for making education central to politics. And at stake here is a notion of education as a moral and political project rooted in the goal of individual empowerment and social emancipation. This is a view of education that encourages human agency, one that is not content to enable people to be only critical thinkers, but also engage individuals and social agents. This is a pedagogical project that recognizes that there is no democracy without knowledgeable and informed citizens. Central to this argument is the notion that pedagogy is always political, not only because it raises questions about the relationship between power and knowledge, between power and values, between power and visions of the future, but also because it's connected to the formation of agency, values, visions of the future, and the ability to speak, write, and act from a position of agency and empowerment. Despite the claims by mainstream and managerial educators, pedagogy is neither neutral, nor is it simply a methodology, which in my mind is often a cover, at least this argument, is often a cover for equating and justifying education as nothing more than training. This is why critical pedagogy matters more than ever. It calls students beyond themselves. It affirms the ethical imperative to care for others. It reconnects historical memory to present struggles. It nurtures agency rather than obedience, and solidarity rather than cynicism. This is a pedagogy that insists that education should be dangerous, that students should learn to talk back, that it's dangerous to racial cleansing, it's dangerous to militarism, it's dangerous to unbridled capitalism and to the politics of hate and ignorance. Critical pedagogy, both in its symbolic and institutional forms, has a vital role to play in fighting the resurgence of false renderings of history, white supremacy, religious fundamentalism, and accelerating state terrorism and ultranationalism. As far-right movements disseminate toxic, racist, and ultra-nationalist images of the past, it's essential to reclaim critical pedagogy as a project crucial to developing and affirming historical consciousness and moral witnessing as central elements of education. It's really interesting how the far right, across the spectrum of far right countries, as you know, really has invested in this notion of historical and social amnesia. It's better not to learn from the past and then to rewrite it in ways that serve their interest than it is to engage history in some kind of critical and analytical way. This is especially true at a time when historical and social amnesia have become a national pastime, particularly in the United States, further normalizing an authoritarian politics that thrives on ignorance, fear, and the suppression of dissent and hate. The merging of power, social media, and everyday life have not only altered time and space, but they have also expanded the reach of culture as an educational force, a culture of lies, cruelty, and bigotry, coupled with the fear of history and a 24/7 flow of information, now wages war on attention spans and the conditions necessary to think, contemplate, and arrive at sound judgments. I mean, this is very interesting because now we have to talk about pedagogy and its relationship to attention, to being attentive, to understand things in their totality, to having some understanding of what it means to take an ethical stand, to have an historical consciousness. We need classrooms that are factories of compliance. We need classrooms that are not factories of compliance, but sanctuaries of critique, critical literacy, and radical hope. We need educators to teach students not simply how to make a living, but how to make a life, committed to justice, equality, and freedom. And we need schools that do more than serve the marketplace, but provide a radical vision of democracy itself. And one of the challenges facing the current generation of educators, students, and others is the need to address a very central question: what should education accomplish in a society? Or more pointedly, what is the role of education in a democracy? What pedagogical, political, and ethical responsibilities should educators, musicians, artists, journalists, and other cultural workers take at a time when there is an alarming rise of authoritarian regimes across the globe, especially in formerly democratic countries such as Turkey, Hungary, India, and Italy? How can educational and ideological practices be connected to the resurrection, it seems to me, of what I might call the radical imagination and broad-based struggles for an insurrectional democracy? How can education be enlisted to reclaim public memory, to challenge the culture of lies, and make visible the historical conditions that have brought us to the brink of catastrophe? In a world where the future is being canceled by climate catastrophe, authoritarian rule, and market fundamentalism, education must help to recover the radical imagination. It must help to imagine a future very different from the present. Any viable notion of critical education needs to create the educational visions and tools to produce a radical shift in individual and mass consciousness, and must be capable of recognizing both the scorched earth policies of a market-based system marked by staggering inequalities and the twisted anti-democratic ideologies that support it. This shift in consciousness cannot occur without pedagogical interventions that speak to people in a way in which they can recognize themselves. They can identify with the issues being addressed and place the privatization of their troubles in broader systemic context. One of the most powerful elements of neoliberal ideology is to convince people that all problems are individual problems, that all problems are a matter of character, that all problems have to be solved exclusively by the individual, so that in that case, the individual can no longer translate their private troubles into larger systemic consideration. This is a massive form of pedagogical depoliticization. It literally depoliticizes people. In Greece, as in much of Europe, you know these pressures well. Neoliberal austerity, the erosion of public institutions, and the rise of xenophobic nationalism have targeted students, workers, migrants, and educators alike. You know what it means to have your universities surveilled, your protests criminalized, your intellectual spaces hollowed out. but perhaps you know more than most. You know what it means to resist. From the Athens Polytech uprising of 1973 to the anti-austerity movements of the past decade and the powerful ongoing protests demanding justice for the 57 lives lost in the Tempe train disaster, one of the most deadliest tragedies in Greece's recent history. Greek people have shown the world that education, both inside and outside of the classroom, can become a site of defiance, mourning, and hope. Today, it seems to me it's more urgent than ever to carry that legacy forward, to reject silence, to turn classrooms into spaces of memory, truth-telling, and collective struggle. Let me finish and conclude by saying, if authoritarianism is to be defeated, whether in the US, Greece, or anywhere else, it will require educators, students, artists, journalists, and others to take a stand. You cannot look away. It'll require a new language of critique that unmasks power and a language of possibility that dares to imagine a different future. As Hannah Arendt warned, fascism does not only live in the past. Its seeds are always present, waiting for the conditions to grow. Our task is to make those conditions inhospitable. We must fight for an education that defends historical memory, sustains civic imagination, and fosters the capacity to think and act ethically. We must teach students not just how to critique, but also to struggle, fight for the truth, and defend and enable a vibrant, radical democracy. Critical pedagogy is a refusal to let violence, ignorance, and repression define our future. It's a call to speak, to act, and teach as if democracy still matters, as if another world is possible, because it is, but only if we fight for it. Thank you.
Some questions. Ναι. Μία ή δύο ερωτήσεις. Πρέπει να θέσεις τον Henry. Τάσο. Ναι. Θες να πεις εδώ.
Hi, Professor. We're very honored to have you here. I have a question for you. I kept a phrase you mentioned, especially the humanities. The concept of agency, usually in social sciences, is approached as a psychological phenomenon. According to a critical educational stance, how would you approach the human agency?
Can you write the question in the chat box for me? Because I can't quite understand it.
What's wrong?
Let me try to answer this. I think that there's a great risk in talking about human agency simply in psychological terms. This is not to argue that it's not important, but I think the risk is that we often collapse the political into the psychological. And I think by doing that, we end up depoliticizing people. So I'm very wary of basically talking about human agency simply in limited psychological terms. And it seems to me to talk about human agency is basically to argue that we need to create the conditions psychologically, politically, educationally, economically, in which people have some sort of control over their lives, over the conditions that shape their lives. It seems to me that to be able to be an agent is to be able to think about the power relations in which one finds oneself. One is able to think critically about the nature of one's own possibilities in the world, and to understand what it means to relate to others and to relate to a larger society. In other words, when we talk about agency, we're talking about the possibility of people being in the world in a way in which that agency lends itself to learn how to govern and not simply be governed. Can I say one other thing about this, just to make this even more clear? Look, I often find myself talking to people who claim that using a psychological language in which the political becomes almost entirely therapeutic, that they talk about choices that people have in ways to suggest that those choices are merely a matter of psychological empowerment. You can be the best you can. You can do it. You only have to will it. And I think it's a very false language. I think that you can't talk about choices unless you talk about constraints. And those constraints are often economic, political, and social. And the way those constraints bear down on choices determines to what degree those choices work. If you grow up in staggering inequality and you go to bad schools, you have bad food, you have bad health care, your choices are limited. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Providence, Rhode Island, in which the only choices we had would become a fire person or a police person. Nobody thought about going to college. Nobody had the money to go to college. People were constantly ill because of the lack of food, and we had very limited opportunities. So to talk about choice and to talk about psychology and to talk about what it means in terms of individual initiatives is also to talk about larger social, political, and social considerations.
Hello, Dr. Giroux, this is Gamish. Can you listen to me? Is the sound okay? You want to write down the question, another question?
Yes.
Okay. Η ερώτηση είναι άμα μπορεί να εξηγήσει τον όρο νεοπιελεύθερος φασισμός. Τι ακριβώς σημαίνει.
Yes, of course. It's a great question, by the way. Thank you so much for asking it. I think that when I talk about neoliberal fascism, I'm talking about how neoliberalism, in a sense, over the course of the last 15 years, has entered into a legitimation crisis. It can no longer defend itself by making a claim that everybody will rise in society. There'll be more social mobility. There'll be more jobs. There'll be greater equality. That's all collapsed. In the face of enormously staggering inequality, the concentration of wealth in relatively few hands, neoliberalism doesn't any longer make an attempt to legitimate itself with promises that it can't keep. Hence, what it now has done, it's now aligned itself with a fascist politics that says the real problems that we have that interfere with neoliberalism and everything else is basically people of color, immigrants, refugees. It's adopted a kind of neo-Nazi logic in order to point to the problems of society so it doesn't have to legitimate its own failures. I call that neoliberal fascism. It also speaks to a concentration of power that is unique to the advancing stage of capitalism, and that is the merging of culture, the new technologies, and everyday life, in which culture becomes a profoundly poisonous sort of pedagogical tool that neoliberalism is in control of and is constantly being used to basically legitimate what I would call an enormously anti-democratic logic. And you see this in Hungary, you see this in India, and you see two things. You see the suppression of critique and the increasing surveillance and outright repression of critical thought and the institutions that control them. And you also see an argument that we've never seen before, and that is that democracy doesn't work. And so you have, as you see in Hungary, with Orban claiming that what we need is a liberal democracy, meaning we'll make you secure, but you no longer will have any rights. That's neoliberal fascism. And its basic argument is rooted in what I would call a form of racial cleansing. That's its basic argument, that citizenship now has to be defined, particularly in the United States, in terms of white Christian nationalist notions of what it means to be a citizen. One could say the same in India. In India, you have it's Hindu nationalism. One has to be Hindu to arrive at the space, to occupy the space of citizenship. So I think that what we're seeing with neoliberalism is something that people like Brecht and Adorno had talked about in the past, and that is you can't talk about fascism until you talk about capitalism. And capitalism is at its endpoint. It no longer can legitimate itself. So now it begins in eliminating all those voices of repression or suppression or resistance that basically would call it into question. That's what I call neoliberal fascism. Thank you so much for the question. I think that what teachers are facing in Greece is increasingly what teachers are facing under a number of neoliberal repressive regimes. And that is that the education is being defined in ways that basically promote not only a pedagogy of repression, but basically undermine the capacity for teachers to have some control over the nature of their classrooms and education itself. This is a way to disempower teachers. You tell them to teach for the test. You involve them in assessment exercises that are almost irrelevant in terms of what it means for students to learn something. And what it does is it basically attempts to redefine education in utterly instrumental terms, while at the same time de-skilling teachers. And I think that what we need to do in this instance, not just simply as individual teachers, but I think collectively, what we need to do is to join together and raise fundamental questions about the vision that this notion of education supports. And it's a vision that basically is rooted in the death of the imagination. It's a vision that basically has nothing to do with understanding schools as a public good. And it's a vision that seems to suggest that the laws of the market, with its forms of efficiency, standardization, mindless kinds of assessment, are basically how we should define schools. So the first case, it says, is to reclaim schools as democratic public spheres, as democratizing institutions. Secondly, we need to understand what it would mean for them to function as democratizing institutions and not to limit teachers to being nothing more than accountants in a pencil factory. And thirdly, I think that teachers need to organize together. They need to organize collectively. They need to wage strikes. They need to work with other social movements. And they need to educate a public that doesn't send their kids to school, to make it clear how vital education is to democracy itself. You don't have a democracy if you don't have informed citizens. You don't have a democracy if students come out not knowing how to raise fundamental questions about power, their own sense of agency, and what it means to govern in a democracy while protecting it. So that's a very important question. And it goes to the heart of the methods used to turn education into training and to basically de-skill teachers so they have no control over the conditions of their own labor. It's got to be stopped. It's too dangerous. It's disempowering. And it's an outright function of what I would call an authoritarian form of education.
Ευχαριστούμε. Με αλληλεγγύη, τελευταία ερώτηση από την αξιολόγηση. Οργανωνόμαστε, σκεφτόμαστε, αποφασιστικόμαστε.
Συλλογικά.
Thank you. Listen, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored. I can't wait to be in Greece again. I hope we can meet and collaborate, and I hope this struggle ends up in a place that we're proud of in the future. Okay. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Ευχαριστούμε για την παρουσία σας, φίλες, συνάδελφοι, φίλες. Νομίζω η φίλος έχει κλείσει. Η δική μου ομιλία βασίζεται στην εισαγωγή του βιβλίου. Είναι τώρα σπίτι ώρα. Την επόμενη φορά, κάποια στιγμή στο συνέδριο, σας περιμένω στο συνέδριο του βιβλίου, θα τα πούμε εκεί.
Ναι, Βασίλη, βεβαίως. Είσαι καλά, είσαι καλά, πώς είναι. Εσύ είσαι εδώ, λοιπόν. Εντάξει, Πώς να γίνει, το έχει εκεί η δουλειά.
Όχι, και το διαφορετικό. Ναι,
Δεν σας κλάδισα αξιοπρεπώς, ήσασταν απασχολημένοι. Το τίτλο τώρα, δεν το ένα κείμενο, αντιγραμματικό, το τίτλο το επανάληψη στο κεφάλι. Είναι πολύ γενικός ο τίτλος, είναι κριτική. Ναι, γιατί έχω στείλει το περιμένω υπογραφή από αυτό και από αυτό. Αλλά δεν το έχει υπογραφικό, το έχω είναι γενικό. Όπως λέμε, να διαβάζω γράμμιση στα ορίτια.
Εδώ με τον Πετρό να το ψέψετε. Έχει συνεργασίες, θα ρίξει να σε πληθύσει.
Για το σχέδιο, μου στέλνει
Όχι, ακόμα τώρα είμαστε... Είμαστε στην εξεργασία των όταν θα βγουν να αναπτυχθούν τα προγράμματα, ποιος κάνει στην αίθουσα, τότε θα μείνει στάτης και τα βασικά.
Τέλεια. Περιμένω να μου
στείλει. Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ευχαριστώ καλά. Εγώ θα στο ρωτάσω. Γεια.
Όταν κάνω σχολικό μου τελειώνω,
για τελειώσατε. Κάμψε με τα πλοκά τελειώνω. Θα προκυρηθούν καινούργια. Θα προκυρηθεί, είναι έτοιμο, καταδειχθεί τα έγγραφα, απλώς η ΕΦΑΕ και την ακόμα είναι η γλώσσα της λογοτεχνίας. Και μετά έρχεται τα STEM και μετά είναι τα αναπηρία.
κάνω μία
πιο πολύ υπάρχει. Εδώ, καλό στο Διανό, στις αρχικές της πολιτείας, θα στο πρώτο μέχρι το τεχνικό και το μοιράζει στους φοιτητές μου. Το μοιράζει στους φοιτητές μου, μαθήματα.
Εγώ τώρα δεν είμαι μεταπτυχιακός, δεν μπορώ να
Αν το τελειώσεις, δεν μπορείς να το πάρεις. Θα πας στα βιβλία. Η κυβέρνηση πολιτείας ήταν. Η κυβέρνηση πολιτείας της Βόλου το βιβλίο, με Γκούναρη, γωνία, πηγαίνοντας προς την Αγία Σοφίας. Άρχισα ένα βιβλίο να το δεις.
Εκεί πέρα υπάρχει.
Γιάννη, φύγανε οι κυβέρνηση πολιτείας, φύγανε. Οι κυβέρνηση πολιτείας φύγανε. Τα βιβλία που φύγανε, κάνε το έξω.
Παρουσιάσεις άλλο υπάρχει αυτογραφείτε στο τύπο. Από αυτό μπορεί να κρατήσεις άμα θέλεις τις ερωτήσεις. Σε κλείνω,